The great chamber of the Galactic Council stretched for nearly a mile in every direction. Its curved walls displaying the flags and symbols of 800 different species from across the known universe. And in this vast hall where the fate of civilizations was decided, humanity was barely a footnote. Ambassador Velthran of the Karuthi hegemony stood at the central podium, his four eyes scanning the assembled delegates with the calm confidence of a species that had ruled their sector for 10,000 years. And today he would deliver his final assessment of the newest addition to the galactic community. Honored delegates, he began, his translator converting his clicking speech into 100 different languages. I have spent 3 of your standard centuries studying the species known as humanity, and I am pleased to report that they pose no threat whatsoever to the stability of our great union. A ripple of relief passed through the chamber, for new species always brought uncertainty, and the galaxy had seen enough wars to last 1,000,000 lifetimes. Velthran activated the holographic display behind him, showing a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star in the outer spiral arm of the galaxy, a region so remote that most spacefaring civilizations had ignored it entirely until human radio signals began reaching the nearest relay stations. The humans are a curious species, Velthran continued, divided into what they call nations, each with its own government, military, and territorial claims. And these nations spend most of their energy competing against each other rather than presenting a unified front to the universe. The display shifted to show maps of Earth, colored in dozens of different shades, representing the various human governments. And the delegates watched with a mixture of amusement and confusion. For most species had unified their homeworlds long before achieving spaceflight. They fight among themselves constantly, Velthran explained. Small conflicts over resources, ideologies, and borders that never seem to fully resolve. And while they have developed impressive technology, they lack the unity required to project power beyond their immediate stellar neighborhood. High Arbiter Zenkora of the Velthan Collective raised one of her manipulator appendages to signal a question, and Velthran nodded for her to speak. What of their military capabilities? She asked, her voice carrying the harmonic undertones of her species. Our records indicate they have fought several large-scale conflicts in their recent history. Velthran made a dismissive gesture with his upper arms, a sign of unconcern among his people. Their last major war ended over a century ago, he replied. And since then they have allowed their military forces to shrink dramatically, preferring to spend their resources on commerce, entertainment, and what they call social programs rather than maintaining combat readiness. He brought up new images showing human cities filled with gleaming towers, shopping districts, and entertainment venues, with no visible military presence anywhere. They have become soft, Velthran declared, comfortable in their peace and prosperity, and the warrior spirit that once defined their species has faded into memory, replaced by a desire for comfort and pleasure that makes them ideal trading partners, but irrelevant as a military consideration. The chamber hummed with agreement, for this was exactly what the council wanted to hear, and several delegates were already calculating how they might exploit human markets for their own benefit in the observation gallery above the main chamber. A small human delegation watched the proceedings through a one-way viewing screen, their faces carefully neutral as they listened to Velthran's assessment. Ambassador Sarah Chun stood at the front of the group, her gray hair pulled back in a simple style that reflected her no-nonsense approach to diplomacy. And beside her stood Admiral James Okonkwo, a tall man with dark skin and eyes that had seen more than he ever spoke about interesting analysis. Chun murmured, her voice too low for anyone but Okonkwo to hear. The Admiral said nothing, but the corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been amusement, and his hand unconsciously moved to touch the old medal he wore beneath his civilian clothes, a reminder of battles the galaxy had never witnessed below them. Valthran was concluding his presentation with a recommendation that humanity be granted observer status in the Council, a ceremonial position that would give them access to trade routes and diplomatic channels, while excluding them from any real decision-making power. They are merchants and entertainers, Valthran summarized, creative and industrious in their own way, but ultimately irrelevant to the balance of power in our galaxy. And I see no reason to treat them as anything more than a minor curiosity. The vote was unanimous in favor of his recommendation. And as the delegates began to file out of the chamber, already forgetting about the insignificant species from the outer rim, none of them noticed the looks exchanged between the humans in the gallery above. What the Council did not know, what they could not know because they had never bothered to truly study human history, was that peace was not the natural state of humanity, but rather an achievement that each generation had to fight to maintain. They did not know about the memorial halls that stood in every major human city, filled with the names of those who had died in conflicts stretching back to the dawn of their civilization. Names that children still learn to honor and remember. They did not know about the military academies that continued to train officers in tactics and strategy, not because war was expected, but because humans understood that the price of peace was eternal vigilance. They did not know about the shipyards hidden in asteroid belts and the weapons platforms concealed in orbital debris fields, insurance policies that humanity hoped would never be needed but refused to abandon. And they certainly did not know about the old soldiers who still manning quiet halls across human space. Men and women who had traded their uniforms for civilian clothes but never lost the skills. They had spent their youth acquiring. Ambassador Chung turned away from the viewing screen and nodded to Admiral Okonkwo. "Let them underestimate us," she said quietly. "It has always been our greatest advantage." The Admiral finally allowed himself a small smile. "The wolves always mistake the shepherd for a sheep," he replied. "Until they threatened the flock." They left the gallery together. Two ordinary-looking humans walking among giants who had already dismissed their entire species as irrelevant. And if anyone had bothered to look closely at the Admiral's eyes, they might have seen something ancient and dangerous lurking there. Something that the comfortable species of the galaxy had long forgotten, but humanity never would. The capacity for violence had not left humanity. It had simply learned to sleep, and those who slept could always wake. The Kethvori Dominion had conquered 43 species across 6 sectors of the galaxy. And their method was as simple as it was brutal, for they would identify an isolated target, deliver an ultimatum demanding complete surrender, and then crush any resistance with overwhelming force before moving on to the next victim. Grand Marshal Kethzen sat upon his command throne aboard the flagship Eternal Dominion, his scaled body covered in the ceremonial armor of his rank, and before him floated a holographic image of a small human colony called New Helsinki, home to approximately 2 million souls who had built their lives on a frozen world at the edge of human space. A pathetic target, his second-in-command observed, barely defended and far from any reinforcement. Kethzen made a sound of agreement deep in his throat, for the humans had been on his list for some time now, ever since his intelligence officers had reported on the divided nature of their civilization and the weakness of their military posture. "The Council has classified them as irrelevant," Kethzen said, his voice carrying the rasping quality of his species. "And irrelevant species make the easiest conquests." He gestured to his communications officer, who immediately began preparing the standard ultimatum transmission, a message that had brought 43 species to their knees and would surely do the same to these soft humans. The message was simple and direct, demanding that the colony of New Helsinki surrender immediately to Kethvori protection, that all human vessels in the sector be handed over for inspection, and that humanity accept integration into the Dominion as a subject species with limited rights and heavy tribute obligations. The deadline was 72 standard hours. Send it to their homeworld. Kethson commanded. Let their leaders know what happens to those who defy the Dominion. The transmission burst across space at faster than light speeds, reaching Earth within minutes and triggering immediate alerts in every government communication center on the planet on New Helsinki itself. Governor Maria Vasquez read the message 3 times before setting down her tablet with hands that trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from a cold fury that she had not felt since her grandfather told her stories of the wars he had survived. She immediately called an emergency session of her cabinet and contacted Earth for guidance, knowing that the response to this threat would determine not just the fate of her colony, but perhaps the future of humanity itself. What happened next would later be studied by historians across the galaxy as one of the most remarkable transformations in recorded history. Within 6 hours of receiving the ultimatum, every major human government went silent. Television broadcast ceased, replaced by test patterns and emergency standby signals. And social media platforms that normally buzzed with constant activity fell quiet as if someone had flipped a switch. Diplomatic channels that had carried endless negotiations between rival nations went dark. And even the petty trade disputes that had occupied human politicians for decades were suddenly abandoned without explanation. The Galactic Council noticed this strange silence and dispatched observation drones to investigate. But the drones were politely but firmly turned away at the edge of human space by patrol vessels that appeared seemingly from nowhere. Ambassador Velthran attempted to contact his human counterparts to offer condolences and perhaps negotiate favorable trade terms with whatever remained after the Kethvori conquest. But his calls went unanswered. They are probably in chaos, he reported to the council, arguing among themselves about how to respond while their enemy prepares to destroy them. Just as I predicted they would, but Velthran was wrong. More wrong than he had ever been in his long career behind the wall of silence. Humanity was not arguing, for the arguments had ended within the first hour when representatives from every nation on Earth and every colony in human space had gathered in an emergency assembly. The debates that normally took months were completed in minutes, because when faced with an existential threat to their children and their future, humans discovered that their differences mattered far less than their shared identity. The vote was held at hour 3, and it was unanimous across every nation, every territory, every station and settlement where humans made their home. They would not surrender. They would not negotiate. They would fight, and they would fight together at hour 6. The silence ended with a single transmission broadcast on every frequency across human space and beyond, reaching Kethvori sensors and council monitors, and every ship and station in range. A woman appeared on screen, middle-aged with iron-gray hair and the bearing of someone who had spent her life preparing for exactly this moment. And she stood before a wall displaying the flags of every human nation, now joined by a single larger banner that showed a blue Earth surrounded by stars. I am Director General Helena Oduya of the United Human Defense Council, she announced, her voice steady and clear, speaking on behalf of all humanity. She paused to let those words sink in, for they represented something that had never existed before in human history. A single voice speaking for the entire species. We have received the ultimatum from the Kethvori Dominion, she continued, and we have considered their demands carefully, consulting with our people across every world we call home. Behind her, screens showed images of the deliberations, the votes, the unanimous decisions made by billions of humans who had set aside their differences in the face of a common enemy. Our response is as follows, Oduya said. And now her voice carried an edge of steel that made veteran soldiers across the galaxy sit up and take notice. We decline. She let the word hang in the air for a moment before continuing. To the Kethvori Dominion. We say this. You have threatened our people, our homes, and our children. And for this you will face consequences that your species has never imagined. So we suggest you withdraw your ultimatum and your fleet while you still have the chance to do so. Her expression hardened into something that observers would later describe as terrifying in its calm certainty. To the Galactic Council, we offer this warning. Stay out of our way. For what comes next is between humanity and those who have chosen to become our enemies. And we will not distinguish between aggressors and those who aid them. The transmission ended, replaced by coordinates and deployment orders that began flowing to human military assets. Across known space, Grand Marshal Kethsen watched the message with growing disbelief. For no species had ever defied the Dominion so openly, and certainly none had ever done so with such apparent confidence. They are bluffing, his second-in-command insisted. They lack the forces to challenge us, but Kethsen was no longer certain. For he had seen something in Director General Oduya's eyes that he recognized from his own reflection. It was the look of someone who had already decided that victory was the only acceptable outcome, and it was the look of someone who was willing to burn the universe to achieve it. The Galactic Council's monitoring stations were designed to detect the movement of fleets and the construction of weapons platforms across thousands of light years. And they had successfully predicted every major conflict in the galaxy for over 10,000 years. So when the sensors began reporting impossible readings from human space, the analysts assumed there must be some kind of malfunction. Check the equipment again, Senior Analyst Yenthril ordered, his compound eyes flickering between multiple screens showing data that made no sense. We have checked it 17 times. His assistant replied, and the readings remain consistent. Yenthril leaned closer to examine the numbers, his analytical mind struggling to accept what they were telling him across human space. Energy signatures were appearing in locations where no significant infrastructure had been recorded. Shipyards that should have been producing civilian transports were suddenly running at full military capacity. And orbital facilities that had been listed as abandoned were coming online with power outputs that rivaled the largest military installations in the galaxy. This is impossible, Yenthril muttered. Where did all of this come from? The answer, had he known to look for it, was hidden in the boring administrative records that the Council had never bothered to examine carefully. For humans had been preparing for this moment since the day they first encountered alien life. And they had done so in ways that would have seemed paranoid to any species that had not spent 10,000 years fighting itself on Earth. The transformation was even more dramatic than what the sensors could detect. Factories that had produced consumer electronics for decades suddenly shifted to military production as workers who had trained for this contingency their entire lives finally put their skills to use. Assembly lines that built luxury vehicles were retooled overnight to produce armored transports, and chemical plants that manufactured household products began synthesizing military-grade explosives and propellants. Universities across the planet emptied as students lined up at recruitment centers that had appeared in every major city, not because anyone forced them to, but because they understood that their civilization was under threat, and they were willing to fight to defend it. The lines stretched for miles in some cities, filled with young people who had grown up in peace, but carried the warrior spirit of their ancestors in their blood. And the recruitment officers processed them as fast as they could, while turning away those who were too young or too old or too essential to other parts of the war effort. But it was not only the young who answered the call across human space. Veterans emerged from retirement to offer their services. Men and women who had served in the small conflicts of the past century and had prayed they would never be needed again. And now they brought their experience and their skills to training camps, where they would turn civilians into soldiers in record time. Admiral James Okonkwo stood in a command center buried deep beneath the surface of Luna, watching screens that showed the mobilization unfolding across human territory. And despite the gravity of the situation, he felt something he had not experienced in decades. Pride status report. He called out, and immediately his staff began updating him on the deployment. The 1st through 3rd fleets have completed assembly and are moving toward the rendezvous point, his operations officer reported. The 4th and 5th are at 80% readiness and will launch within 12 hours. What about the reserve ships? We have brought 4,000 vessels out of mothball storage so far, with another 6,000 undergoing rapid refurbishment in the asteroid shipyards. Okonkwo nodded, remembering how the Council observers had laughed at humanity's habit of preserving old warships rather than scrapping them, calling it a waste of resources and a sign of their primitive attachment to the past. Those observers had not understood that humans never threw away anything that might one day be needed. The screens showed other assets coming online as well. Weapons platforms that had been hidden in asteroid fields for generations. Defense satellites that had been disguised as civilian communications relays. And ground-based systems that had been buried beneath the surfaces of dozens of worlds. Humanity had hoped these preparations would never be necessary, but they had never allowed themselves to believe that hope was a strategy on the colony world of Mars. General Sarah Washington watched as troop transports loaded with soldiers lifted off from bases that had been secretly maintained for exactly this purpose, and she allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction at the thought of the enemy who had no idea what was coming. The Kethvari had studied human history. She knew, but they had studied it the way the Council studied it, looking at the dates of treaties and the boundaries of nations without understanding what lay beneath the surface. They saw that humanity had not fought major war in over a century and concluded that humans had forgotten how to fight. They did not see the veterans who passed down their knowledge to the next generation. They did not see the military academies that continued to train officers in tactics that had been refined through 10,000 years of continuous warfare. They did not see the cultural memory that kept the lessons of past conflicts alive in stories and songs and monuments that stood in every human city, and they certainly did not see the cold fury that burned in the hearts of ordinary humans when they learned that their children had been threatened by an alien empire that thought they were weak. Director General Helena Oduya addressed the combined human forces via quantum link, her image appearing on screens aboard every ship and every command center across human space. "You know why we are here," she said simply. "Our people have been threatened, our colonies have been targeted, and our future has been put at risk by an enemy who believes we lack the will to defend ourselves." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of all human history. "They are wrong. Our ancestors survived ice ages and plagues and wars that killed millions, and they did not give up because giving up was never in our nature. So we will not give up now. Some of you will not come home from this fight, and I will not pretend otherwise. But your sacrifice will ensure that our children and their children will live free. And that is a legacy worth any price. Go now, and show the galaxy what humanity can do when we stop being peaceful." The transmission ended, and across human space, engines roared to life as the largest military force in galactic history began its march toward the enemy. Grand Marshal Kethson received the intelligence reports with growing alarm, for his analysts were now telling him that the human fleet assembling to meet him was larger than anything the Dominion had ever faced. "How is this possible?" he demanded. "Our information said they had no unified military." They did not. his intelligence chief replied nervously. Until 72 hours ago, Kethzan stared at the tactical display, showing the human formations moving toward New Helsinki. And for the first time in his long career of conquest, he felt something unfamiliar doubt. He had awakened something that should have been left sleeping. And now he would have to face the consequences. The humans were coming and they were angry. Grand Marshal Kethzan had brought 2,000 warships to the frozen world of New Helsinki, a force that had crushed empires and broken the will of species who had ruled their sectors for millennia. And as his fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system, he expected to see a token defense that would crumble within hours. What he saw instead made his blood run cold. The 1st through 7th combined human fleets hung in space between his armada and the colony, a wall of steel and fury that stretched across his entire sensor display. And as his tactical officers calculated the enemy numbers, they reported figures that seemed impossible. 12,000 vessels confirmed, his sensor chief announced, his voice trembling, with more arriving every hour. Kethzan said nothing, his mind struggling to accept that the species the council had dismissed as irrelevant had assembled a force 6 times larger than his own in less than a standard week. But he was the Grand Marshal of the HFY Dominion, conqueror of 43 species, and he had not risen to his position by retreating from challenges. All ships advance, he commanded. We will show these humans the price of defiance. The battle began at 0347 Standard Time when the first HFY missile salvo streaked toward the human lines. And what happened over the next 11 hours would become the most studied military engagement in galactic history. Admiral Okonkwo commanded the human forces from the bridge of the flagship United Earth, his calm voice issuing orders that sent thousands of ships into coordinated action. And from the first exchange of fire, it became clear that the HFY had drastically underestimated their enemy human. Tactics were unlike anything in the Dominion's databases. Chaotic and unpredictable, and seemingly suicidal to observers, who did not understand the method behind the madness. Small fighter craft dove directly into enemy formations, weaving between capital ships and drawing fire away from the larger human vessels, while strike teams targeted critical systems with surgical precision. Damaged human ships refused to retreat as doctrine demanded, instead accelerating toward enemy positions and continuing to fight until their weapons were destroyed and their hulls were breached. And even then, many of them simply rammed the nearest HFY vessel rather than allow themselves to drift helplessly. HFY commanders had studied human military history before the battle, reading about famous victories and legendary generals, but they had failed to understand the most important lesson that history could teach. Humans did not fight to win, they fought to make their enemies lose, and they would accept any cost to achieve that goal. 3 hours into the battle, the HFY right flank collapsed when a human carrier group executed a maneuver that should have been impossible, jumping to faster than light speed inside the combat zone and emerging directly behind the enemy formation. A tactic so dangerous that no other species would have attempted it. The carrier group was destroyed within minutes, but not before launching every fighter and bomber it carried directly into the HFY command structure, crippling a dozen capital ships and killing 3 senior admirals by hour 6. Grand Marshal Kethzan was receiving reports of human marines boarding his vessels, fighting hand-to-hand in corridors too cramped for energy weapons, and his soldiers who had never faced ground combat against a determined enemy were being overwhelmed by humans who seemed to feel no fear and showed no mercy. The boarding teams were not there to capture the ships. They were there to kill everyone aboard. Human losses mounted as the battle continued, and Admiral Okonkwo watched the casualty reports with a heavy heart, even as he issued orders to press the attack, knowing that every death was a tragedy. but also knowing that retreat would only lead to more deaths in the long run. The Fourth Fleet is at 50% strength. His aide reported, Admiral Chun is requesting permission to withdraw and regroup. Denied, Okonkwo replied. Tell Chun to hold the line at any cost. He paused, then added more quietly. And tell her that her sacrifice will be remembered. The Fourth Fleet fought for another 2 hours before being effectively destroyed. But they bought time for the Sixth and Seventh Fleets to complete their flanking maneuver. And when those fresh forces struck the Kethvori rear, the battle turned decisively in humanity's favor. Grand Marshal Kethzin watched. His tactical display turned from amber to red as ship after ship was destroyed or disabled. And he realized with growing horror that he was witnessing the end of the Kethvori Dominion's reputation as an invincible force. Signal the retreat, he ordered, his voice hollow with defeat. All ships fall back to the jump point, but the humans did not allow retreats. 3 human destroyers, their crews already dying from radiation exposure that had breached their reactor shielding, broke off from the main formation and pursued the Kethvori flagship at maximum acceleration. Ignoring orders to stand down and refusing to answer hails from their own command, their captains had already made their decision, and their crews had agreed unanimously they would not let the architect of this invasion escape to threaten humanity again. The destroyers caught the Eternal Dominion at the edge of the system, their weapons pounding the flagship's shields, while Kethzan screamed orders for his escort ships to protect him. But the escorts were too far away, and the human destroyers were too fast when their weapons finally fell silent. Drained of all ammunition, the 3 destroyers did not stop. They accelerated directly into the Eternal Dominion's hull, their reactors set to overload, and the synchronized explosion tore the Kethvori flagship apart in a flash of light that could be seen from the surface of New Helsinki Grand. Marshal Kethzan died never understanding how a species that had seemed so weak could fight with such terrible fury when the battle finally ended at hour 11. The Kethvori fleet had ceased to exist as a fighting force, with fewer than 200 ships escaping the system to bring news of the disaster back to their homeworld. Human losses were significant. Nearly 3,000 vessels destroyed and over 2 million soldiers and sailors killed. But the survivors did not mourn, not yet. They watched their sensors as reinforcements continued to arrive. Fresh fleets that had been assembling at staging points across human space. And they understood that the Battle of New Helsinki was not the end of this war. It was only the beginning. Admiral Okonkwo addressed his forces as the last Kethvori survivors fled into faster-than-light travel. Today we have shown the galaxy what happens to those who threaten our people, he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and grief. But our work is not done. For as long as the Kethvori Dominion exists, they will remain a threat to humanity and to every other species they have conquered. He paused, looking at the tactical display that showed the vast human fleet assembling for the next phase of operations. So we will not stop here. We will pursue them to their homeworld if necessary, and we will ensure that no one ever threatens our children again. The fleet acknowledged his orders with a single word that echoed across quantum link channels throughout human space. Forward and forward they went. The war lasted 8 months, and in that time, humanity taught the galaxy a lesson it would never forget. After the victory at New Helsinki, Admiral Okonkwo did not pause to celebrate or consolidate his gains, instead pushing his forces forward. In a relentless campaign that swept through Kethvori space like a storm of vengeance, colony after colony fell to human assault. Not through the brutal conquest that the Dominion had practiced, but through targeted strikes that destroyed military installations while leaving civilian populations unharmed. And this distinction confused Kethvori commanders who could not understand Why humanity showed mercy to those who had threatened to enslave them? The answer was simple. Though the HFY never grasped it, humans were not fighting to destroy a species. They were fighting to end a threat. And that meant liberating the 43 species that the Dominion had conquered over the centuries. Peoples who had lived under HFY oppression for so long that they had forgotten what freedom felt like on world after world. Human ground forces worked alongside local resistance fighters to dismantle the HFY occupation, and the stories that emerged from these campaigns would become legends told across the galaxy for generations. A human medic who shielded wounded alien civilians with her own body during an artillery barrage, surviving only because her armor absorbed the fragments that would have killed her. A squad of human marines who held a bridge against overwhelming odds for 18 hours, buying time for a convoy of refugees to escape the combat zone. A human admiral who diverted his entire supply fleet to provide food and medicine to a liberated planet. Even though it meant his own forces would have to go without, these were the stories that spread across the galaxy, carried by refugees and diplomats and even by HFY prisoners who could not reconcile the mercy they received with the brutality they had been taught to expect. The Galactic Council watched these events with growing amazement and no small amount of fear. For they had dismissed humanity as irrelevant only months before. And now they were witnessing this supposedly weak species dismantle one of the most powerful military forces in known space. Emergency sessions were held to discuss the implications of human military capability, and some delegates proposed intervening to stop the conflict before humanity grew too powerful to control. Ambassador Velthran, whose assessment had been so catastrophically wrong, spoke against this proposal with uncharacteristic humility. "We made a terrible error in judgment," he told the council, "and we must not compound that error by making ourselves enemies of a species that has already proven it can defeat a force that none of us could have challenged. What do you suggest?" High Arbiter Zenkara asked. "We stay out of their way." Velthran replied, "Exactly as they requested." The council heeded his advice, and humanity continued its campaign without interference. By month 6, the HFY homeworld was blockaded by a human fleet so large that it obscured the stars from the surface. And the Dominion's leadership finally accepted that they could not win this war. The surrender negotiations were brief. Humanity demanded the complete dissolution of the HFY military, the release of all enslaved species, and reparations to be paid to every world the Dominion had conquered. The HFY accepted every term without argument, for they had learned that humans did not make idle threats. 2 months later, Director General Helena Oduya stood before the Galactic Council in the same chamber where Velthran had dismissed her species as irrelevant, and the assembled delegates watched her with expressions ranging from respect to terror. She wore a simple uniform bearing no medals or decorations. For humanity did not celebrate war even when they won it. The conflict between humanity and the HFY Dominion has concluded, she announced, her voice carrying across the vast chamber. The Dominion has surrendered unconditionally. Their military has been disarmed, and their conquered species have been liberated. She paused, her eyes moving across the assembled delegates with an intensity that made several of them look away. Humanity did not seek this war. She continued, "We did not want it, and we take no joy in the destruction we have caused. But we will not apologize for defending our people and our future." Her expression hardened, and when she spoke again, her words carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Let this serve as a notice to every species in this galaxy. For we want peace. We have always wanted peace, and we will always choose diplomacy over violence when that choice is available to us. But if you threaten our people, if you target our colonies, if you put our children at risk, then you will face the full fury of a species that spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of war before we ever reached the stars." She stepped forward, and even the most ancient and powerful delegates found themselves leaning back from the force of her presence. "We have demonstrated what we are capable of when we stop being peaceful," she said, "and I sincerely hope that no one in this chamber ever needs to witness it again." She stepped back from the podium and adjusted her uniform with calm precision. "Humanity will now resume observer status in this council, for we have commerce to conduct and art to create and families to raise. And these are the things that matter to us, not conquest or domination." She smiled, and it was not a friendly expression. "We trust the council will have no objections." The council had none in the centuries that followed. The galaxy entered an era of unprecedented peace, for conflicts that would once have escalated into wars were now resolved through negotiation and compromise. And aggressors who might have conquered their neighbors instead found reasons to seek diplomatic solutions. No one spoke openly about why this change had occurred, but everyone understood. The humans were watching, and they remembered what they were capable of on Earth. The memorial for those who fell in the HFY War stood in a garden that had once been a battlefield, a simple wall bearing the names of 2 million men and women who had given their lives to protect humanity's future. Children came there on school trips to learn about the war their grandparents had fought, and they would trace the names with their fingers and wonder at the courage of those who had answered the call when their species needed them. Old veterans gathered there on the anniversary of the Battle of New Helsinki, their numbers shrinking each year as time claimed those the war had spared. And they would stand in silence together and remember friends who had not come home, and sometimes, when the galaxy seemed to be forgetting the lessons of the past, a diplomat from some ambitious species would visit the memorial as part of their cultural exchange. And they would see the names stretching endlessly across the wall, and they would understand something important. Humanity preferred peace, but they had never forgotten how to fight, and they never would. This was the legacy of the HFY War. Not the victories or the conquests or the political changes that followed, but a simple truth that echoed across the galaxy whenever anyone considered challenging humanity. Threaten them at your peril, for the quiet ones are always the most dangerous. And humanity had proven beyond all doubt that they were the quietest species of all until they were not.